And we're back. I don't know if I will wind up posting this all as one video, hopefully, if I can figure out how to do that. Otherwise, this will be a part 2. Let's go back into the questions. How have you built on those first studies? I expanded my Houston study. I wanted to know whether the Houston example was an outlier. That's how the first book on environmental justice came about. I wrote Dumping in Dixie in 1989, but it took me a year to get that book printed. I had to clear data showing that this discrimination was happening from Houston to Dallas, to the Louisiana Cancer Alley, to the Alabama Black Belt, to the West Virginia. But the publisher said, there's no such thing as environmental justice. Everybody is treated the same. The environment is neutral. All of what we've done since the Houston study has intentionally challenged the dominant paradigm. We argue that communities that have somehow been left out and left behind should be first in line when we talk about protection. Regulation should protect the most vulnerable populations, especially children of color. Now, environmental justice is not just in the US, it's global. It has been adopted into environmental reparation efforts. We talk about making our communities whole because of the damage the fossil fuel industry has caused. We talk about repairing our communities in a global sense. Reparations have translated into the Loss and Damage Fund, a pot of money established by higher income countries at the 2022 United Nations Climate Change Conference. The fund aims to mitigate harm more developed countries have caused in less developed nations, which have contributed the least to climate change. They're feeling the pain and suffering first, worst, and longest. It took 27 climate summits before the Loss and Damage Fund was adopted as a policy. The road to where we are now has not been a bed of roses. We've always had detractors and people who have been well funded in fights against us. What about global environmental racism and the importance of using a global lens? We held our first, and I'm going to stop here and just say, if you have this in front of you, there are graphs and more written around the graphs. So it would be good to take a look at that so that you're not missing anything, because looking at the graphs adds a lot to understanding the story. But I'm here to get you through the bulk of it. You should really come back and look at the graphs, or it's just not going to make as much sense. What about global environmental racism and the importance of using a global lens? We held out our first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit in 1991, and representatives attended from the vast majority of the United States, as well as several foreign countries and tribal nations. Our principles of environmental justice, which include the safety of workers, the rights of indigenous peoples, and the honoring of nature, have been translated into half a dozen languages. And globally, in countries that have suffered because of colonialism, imperialism, and racism, communities are now applying that same environmental justice lens to their organizing. Our principles of environmental justice resonated with the Global South. These countries that have contributed the least to climate change are feeling that pain and suffering right now, as they have been for decades. The environmental and justice framework that we use for the research of the U.S. has expanded to universities across the world. South Africa, Australia, Scotland, in some cases, they use a racial lens. They use not a racial lens, but an equity lens that looks at gender, income, formal colonization, status, and market forces that have stripped people of the power to decide for themselves whether they want a new project in their communities. This research is supported by the framework that we set in place, one that uses a community-university partnership. The people who are most negatively impacted also carry knowledge and solutions. These decisions affect their homes, their families, and their lives, so it's important that they remain involved. I feel like I read something wrong. No, that was right. Community science is probably the fastest growing part of the global climate and environmental justice movement. How did race come to be such a defining factor in the US for who gets clean air or water and who does not? Racism is deeply ingrained in America's DNA. Race has also played a significant part in who's free, who gets educated, and who is a citizen. There was slavery, then emancipation, and Jim Crow segregation, where separate but equal was codified. If a black person, for example, paid the same taxes as a white person, those taxes were not spent in a way that gave them equal protection and treatment. The Civil Rights Act wasn't passed until 1964. Racial redlining drew a line around black and brown neighborhoods, labeling them as dangerous and undesirable for loans. That prevented our neighborhoods from benefiting from infrastructure such as sewer and water systems. Here's another big graph that we should look at. We're now seeing the legacies of that racism. Neighborhoods that were redlined 100 years ago are hotter today because of urban heat islands. They have no tree canopy or parks or green space. They're more prone to flooding because they lack flood protection. They are more prone to industrial pollution, and we've learned that the same neighborhoods were more prone to COVID, hospitalizations, and deaths. These are all examples of how past racism keeps getting transferred forward. It increases vulnerability. You've been doing this for almost 50 years now. What keeps you going? I've seen environmental justice move from a footnote to a headline, which means we are making inroads and progress in research and in policy. Even though we've made strides, we have a long way to go. Just having the data has never been enough. We must take these findings and convert them to policy. You have to marry facts with action, and there's not enough action, even after all the reams and reams of studies. What comes next for you? We have a couple of projects. One is our participation in the U.S. government's Justice 40 initiative, which is funded by the Bezos Earth Fund. It looks at how our center can work with communities and use our HBCU, or Historically Black College or University, consortium to help communities that have been underserved and invisible when it comes to issues around climate, economic development, housing, transportation, and clean energy. Another is a Bloomberg project we're participating in that looks beyond petrochemicals. How do we explore transitioning to a clean energy economy and, at the same time, make sure that transition is equitable, fair, and just? We are helping community-based organizations in Texas resist the 80-plus new oil and gas facilities proposed for Houston, Beaumont, Port Arthur, and Corpus Christi. Those dashes are throwing me off. Areas already impacted by petrochemical plants. This is complemented by a study we're doing that examines the environmental justice implications of rapid permitting and build out of terminals for liquefied natural gas in the Gulf Coast. Ironically, many of the new facilities are being proposed in communities where most residents have low incomes or are people of color and where they are already burdened by petrochemical plants. We are also looking at the Inflation Reduction Act and the extent to which our center can collaborate with other organizations to ensure a holistic approach when we talk about greenhouse gas reduction. When we talk about cutting emissions, we're also talking about creating green jobs and about supporting small business entrepreneurs so they can be productive and innovative. It's about getting more of our young people of color interested in science, technology, and engineering so we can build out a pipeline for the future. The environmental and climate justice movement today is intergenerational, and that's exciting. I've been doing this for 40 plus years. I'm a boomer and proud of it. Still fighting and still standing. But the fact is, millennials and Zoomers and Gen Xers combined outnumber my generation. We need to develop a strong intergenerational partnership so these younger people don't have to hit brick walls. We will get to the point where we will address all these challenges we have faced. Many are artificial barriers that we can break down to move more quickly towards solutions. We can take this quest for justice and pass the baton. That's how we will cross the finish line. Woo! I'll tell you. My name is Willow. I'm just a person who reads things from my bedroom so you don't have to. Again, this was Innovations in Environmental Health Equity. Hard Truths from Hard Data. The Father of Environmental Justice reflects on the movement he created by Yessenia Funes. Y'all, when they do these articles where instead of just being like a page of text, it's like all of these little tiny, like 3 columns across one page. So many words get cut in half with the dashes, and it throws my reading off.